Thank you very much for the introduction. And today my topic is about Boethius and Anselm's solution to the paradox between free will and divine knowledge, especially in terms of their conceptions of eternity. And the structure of my talk is pretty straightforward, as you can see here. So first, I shall briefly introduce the philosophical problem and some historical background about Boethius and Anselm. And then I shall discuss their solutions respectively, as well as some problems existing in their solutions. So now let's just start. So in fact, there is a long history of debate on the threat exerted on free will by divine knowledge. I shall not go through the whole spectrum of the discussions here, but just briefly set out the problem. So the paradox between divine foreknowledge and future contingent events is that between the nature of divine knowledge and the metaphysical status of future contingent, especially including the future free choice of will. Divine knowledge has two indispensable characteristics: infallibility and certainty. Certainty refers to the definite truth value of a statement. According to the correspondence theory of truth, in order that a statement has a definite truth value, the existing status of the corresponding external event must be definite as well. However, from the point of view of a libertarian, the future contingent are generally open. In other words, it is intrinsically uncertain whether they will occur or not. Infallibility indicates the absolute correctness of divine knowledge. Therefore, necessarily, if God knows P, then P. In other words, the infallibility of God's knowledge endorses the absolute truth of a future contingent's definite consequence, and asserts that on a metaphysical level, all future contingents have been causally closed at this moment, just as the present and past contingents. However, again, in the view of a libertarian, the consequence of the future contingent caused by a person's free will of choice is cognitively defeasible, meaning that people still have the genuine free power to bring about something in the future differently at present. And as for a contemporary philosopher, conceptually, knowledge in itself does not have any physical compelling power to necessitate future contingents. It does not constitute a concrete power to influence someone's decision-making process. And I think this is very easy to understand. So for example, I know that you are sitting at this moment, but my knowledge about your sitting has nothing to do with why you are sitting at this moment. So knowledge safely stays in the epistemic realm, but this is not the case with regard to divine knowledge for many medieval thinkers. So some of medieval thinkers would gladly accept that divine knowledge in itself is a causative power, which easily crosses the boundary of epistemic realm. So therefore, apart from the seemingly indissoluble paradox between the nature of knowledge and future contingents, divine knowledge contains more destructive metaphysical implications. So given the question, how could God infallibly acquire the knowledge, which is certain, about future events, which are uncertain? And the answer is not excluded naturally from a medieval thinker that future contingents, in fact, are not contingent, but are predetermined, either you can say by God's causative knowledge or by God's providence. In any case, God knows because he causes. In order to avoid this deterministic consequence, various solutions are provided in the Middle Age. And in this talk, I shall provide a comparison between Boethius' solution and Anselm's solution to this paradox. And now, let me just have a very brief historical introduction of the background of these two thinkers. So Boethius was born at the end of Roman Empire. He was recognized as one of the most important thinkers between the ancient antiquity and the Latin Middle Ages. He is well known for the Latin translation and commentaries on Aristotle's logical works. Before he died, he finished a more popular philosophical work called Consolatio Philosophiae, which is a dialogue between Boethius and Lady Philosophy in prison. The main text I shall discuss today is from this work, and throughout my talk, I shall call Lady Philosophy as Boethius the author, and Boethius in the text as Boethius the character. It is said that inheriting the legacy from the Neoplatonic tradition, Boethius starts the trend of internalism in response to the paradox between free will and divine knowledge, and have far-reaching influence on the later medieval discussions with regard to this problem. And Anselm of Canterbury is the outstanding philosopher and theologian in the 11th century. He is especially well known for the ontological argument for the existence of God. And Anselm's writing style is distinctive in his age. And so the popular way of writing philosophy or theology during the Middle Age is to cite authority or scriptures. But Anselm himself seldom explicitly cites anyone. Rather, he absorbs all sources and incorporates it into his own rational thinking. So his writing style is rather philosophically precise and concise. And Anselm is commonly regarded as a follower of Boethius concerning this paradox. But I think their solutions are very different, and it is important to point out their contrast, especially with regard to their conception of eternity. And so it is noteworthy that when I say epistemic eternalism, I do not mean that Boethius' notion of eternity has nothing to do with God's existence. I only mean that the essential ingredient in Boethius' solution to the paradox between divine foreknowledge and free will is the eternal and simple status of divine knowledge. And perhaps there is a better term for it, but let's now just stick to this name. So now let's just start from Boethius' solution. Boethius' solution is made up of three elements: the distinction between simple and conditional necessity, the principle of modes of cognition, and God's epistemic eternity and simplicity. I shall go through these three elements one by one. Boethius discloses his mature thought on the distinction between simple and conditional necessity in Consolatio Philosophiae. I shall read this passage first, and the golden part is the part I want to draw your attention to. There are in fact two necessities. One is simple, such as that it is necessary that all human beings are mortal. The other is conditional, as when it is necessary that a man is walking if you know that he is walking. For whatever anyone knows cannot exist in any other way than it is known to exist. But this condition does not at all draw along with it that other simple necessity. For it is not the thing's own nature that makes this necessity, but only the addition of condition. For no one compels someone who is walking voluntarily to walk, although when he is walking, it is necessary he is walking. So in Boethius' view, simple necessity indicates the ontological modal status of something, which depends on the nature of things alone. Simple necessity does not amount to temporality, nor to actuality. What is necessary simpliciter is always true, yet not anything that is always true is necessary simpliciter. Conditional necessity, by contrast, is independent of the nature of things, but derived from certain external conditions. And just as the paragraph I cited here, Boethius, the author, provides two slightly different examples of conditional necessity. The first one is that when it is necessary that a man is walking, if you know that he is walking. The second one is that when someone is walking, it is necessary he is walking. So in the first example, the necessity is derived from the infallibility of knowledge, while the second example refers to the necessity of the present, which is the consequent entailed from the irrevocability of temporal facts. Both the infallibility of knowledge and the irrevocability of temporal facts are separate from the conception of the ontological modality. Yet, these external conditions do not remove the fact that this event in nature is contingent and can be actualized otherwise when no such condition is attached. So, for example, given that God foreknows that I will choose to drink a cup of tea tomorrow morning, somehow my future choice is fixed because God's knowledge is absolutely right. In the first sight, this fixedness can be very problematic insofar as it suggests that my future choice is not cognitively defeasible even before I really make my mind. So the distinction between simple and conditional necessity enters into the picture, serving to clarify that the future contingent events are fixed nearly in the same way as the present and past contingent events. When someone infallibly knows that I am walking now, or given the temporal fact that I am walking, necessarily I am walking, but this necessity is not incompatible with the fact that I could have not been walking, according to my nature. However, this distinction does not solve all of the problem, because the real problem is that how could a future contingent be conditionally necessary in the same way as a present or a past contingent event? According to Boethius the author, conditional necessity governing future contingents is derived from divine knowledge. However, intuitively, only the events with a definite outcome can constitute the proper object of knowledge. So unlike present and past contingents which have occurred, the outcome of future contingents, especially those events generated by free choice of will, are intrinsically uncertain. What is intrinsically uncertain cannot constitute the object of any knowledge of which the nature is intrinsically certain. Boethius the author's reply to this question is that divine knowledge does not require a definite object as the truth maker, or say the external cause of truth. To argue this, he first puts forward what we call as the principle of modes of cognition. And to save time, I shall not read the whole passage, but just the sentences I bolded. So this principle states that everything that is perceived is grasped, not according to its own force, but rather according to the capability of those who perceive it. For since every judgment exists as an act of the one who judges, it is necessarily the case that all who judge bring their work to completion by their own true powers and not by a power outside of themselves. So this paragraph points out that what can be perceived is not up to the power and nature of the object of knowledge, but up to the power and nature owned by the perceiver. It's the nature of the perceiver that decides the mode of cognition. To be more precise, what this principle points out is that it is the nature or the power of the cognitive faculty that decides what is the truth maker of a belief or knowledge about something, but not the nature of the object. So, for example, when we see an object is round, we know that an object is round. It is not the round object, however, by nature that regulates that it is the truth maker of our knowledge. But the limit of our sense perception regulates that. If it needs to form a true belief, it must be based on the material shape of the object. By contrast, with regard to our other cognitive faculties, for instance, the imagination or reason, they do not need the material shape to be the truth maker. So therefore, even with respect to one and the same object, different levels of knowledge can be formed through different cognitive modes. Some perceivers can form a true belief about something in terms of their own cognitive power, while some other perceivers cannot have the same true belief about the same thing on account of their relatively limited power. Now, applying this principle to the knowledge about future contingents, with regard to us human beings, our existence is always within the passage of time. This condition restricts our cognitive mode because all of our cognitive faculties are trapped in the succession of time. Our knowledge about contingent events that we can access are only those actualized temporal facts, which are certain. Given the future has not yet come, only past and present facts can be the proper object of knowledge about contingents, and we can only assign truth or false value to the present and the past contingents. But we are not able to acquire any knowledge about future contingents because they have not been actualized yet, and the causal trend has not been determined either. So our beliefs about the future lack a truth maker for us, despite the fact that it is necessary that a future contingent will be either true or false when the moment comes. However, God has a totally different mode of cognition by which he can have truth beliefs about any contingents without depending on any definite fact. So how does God have this power? According to this principle, an agent's cognitive power fits with its own nature. So now the problem reduces to what is God's nature? And now is the time for us to proceed to the third element of Boethius' solution, that is God's eternity and simplicity. And I shall read Boethius' account about God's eternity first. Eternity is a possession of life, a possession simultaneously entire and perfect, which has no end. This becomes clear in a more transparent way from a comparison with temporal things. For whatever exists in time proceeds as a present things from the things that have happened into the things that are going to happen. And there is nothing that has been established in time that is able to embrace the entire space of its own life at one and the same time. There is a scholarly debate over how to interpret this passage. And I myself think the most plausible interpretation is that the Boethian God should be regarded as a timeless duration, precisely in the sense that there is a temporal relation or order between the present, the past, the future of God's eternal life, but God's present, past, and the future do not exist successively. Rather, they exist simultaneously as a whole without any succession. So when I say that the Boethian God lives out of time, the precise meaning is that God does not share the common mode of temporality with temporal creatures. So God is just out of our temporality. God's existence bears the temporal relation, but that relation is represented in a non-linear and indiscrete way. Non-linear means that nothing that is to come being absent to God's eternity. Nothing of what has passed having flowed away from God's eternity. Indiscrete means that there is no transition from existence to non-existence, or conversely, with regard to every instant of God's life. God's life is not trapped in only one particular instant at one moment, and then carried by the flow of successive temporality to the next moment, but rather contains all moments at once. And moreover, Boethius describes God's internal presence as simplicity, and given divine simplicity, God's metaphysical status and his epistemic status must have the same attribute, as Boethius explains in this passage. Since every judgment grasps the things that are subject to it in accordance with its own nature, and since God has an ever-eternal and ever-present moment condition, his knowledge as well has passed beyond all the motion of time and is stable in the simplicity of its own present. It embraces the infinite riches of what has passed and what is to come, and in its own simple perception, it looks at all things as if they are being carried out now. So, should you want to ponder the foresight by which God distinguishes all things, you will more accurately determine that it is not for knowledge as of something that is to come, but rather of a knowledge of a never-failing present. So given that Boethius bears the assumption that the cognitive power is in accordance with the perceiver's power and nature, so although we human beings are restricted by our successive temporality, we cannot perceive the metaphysical status of eternity, but we can still theoretically describe God's relation with time, and we can understand that God's simple nature is parallel with God's simple knowledge. Since God's existence is internal and simple, God's knowledge is also not bound by the temporal facts in the succession of time and does not experience any change within the flow of time and the change of space. Nothing needs or indeed can be added or reduced in the totality of God's knowledge. God's knowledge is maximally inclusive. So until now, so far so good, it appears that Boethius does believe that the future is intrinsically uncertain. It is only because God has the unique power that he is able to grasp the results of future contingents. So for Boethius, it seems that the successive temporality is real, and it is true that future contingents in no way exist, nor are they predetermined in any way. However, the first problem within this solution is that, despite the fact that God's own existence does not follow the successive temporality, this status does not affect the metaphysics of the temporality of our world. God's own eternal condition only entitles his cognitive power to be beyond time and space, which entails his knowledge is inclusive. So in this sense, Boethius jumps from the metaphysical accounts of God's own eternal status to God's internal knowledge of everything. God's metaphysical eternity lays the foundation for God's epistemic eternity. So now I will discuss some problems in these solutions. So the first problem is that, admittedly, God's cognitive power is not completely comprehensible to human beings. For instance, we do not know what is the truth maker according to God's cognition. We only know that God, in terms of his transcendental cognitive power, is able to grasp the development of everything without any mistakes. So with only one glance, all information about a certain object is unpacked in front of God. But nobody knows how exactly it works. So there is still the mysterious elements embedded in God's cognitive power. And the more serious problem within Boethius' solution is about the inconsistency of his own texts. So one passage at the end of the chapter indicates that Boethius thinks that God's knowledge has itself established the status of all things. It seems that perhaps for Boethius, there is no need to separate God's knowledge from God's existence or God's acts in the end. He wants to clarify that it is God himself set up everything's existing status. And even more, God's knowledge must be causative, since it is through knowing that God causes everything. So on this reading, God knows what will happen in our future because he himself causes everything to happen in his internal dimension. In this sense, God has a direct knowledge of everything. But if so, Boethius is still a determinist with respect to divine predestination. And that rather makes his trying to get out of the deterministic implication of divine knowledge pretty futile. Now I continue to explain Anselm's solution. Anselm explicitly sets up his purpose as a free will defense in the discussions about divine knowledge in the De Concordia, which is his last complete work. And his solution is made up of two elements: the distinction between the antecedent and the subsequent necessity. The other one is the eternity as a higher dimension. So let's look at the text about the antecedent necessity first. Anselm states that for all necessity is either compulsion or constraint. These two necessities are related to each other as contraries, just like necessary and impossible. For whatever is compelled to exist is constrained from not existing, and what is compelled not to exist is constrained from existing. Just as what is necessary to exist is impossible not to exist, and what is necessary not to exist is impossible to exist, and vice versa. The next passage is about subsequent necessity. But that subsequent necessity does not compel or constrain anything to be or not to be. It is because something is posited as existing that its existence is said to be necessary, and because something is posited as not existing that its non-existence is said to be necessary, not because necessity compels or constrains it to be or not to be. I did not cite all relevant passages about Anselm's accounts of necessity, but just some key passage, and you got the spirit. And I shall explain this further. So for Anselm, antecedent necessity precisely refers to the compulsion or constraint exerted by an external agency. Subsequent necessity reduces to the irrevocability of temporal facts. So faced with the paradox between free will and divine knowledge, Anselm first clarifies that the content of God's foreknowledge about a future contingent is not that something will occur by a certain compelling necessity. Rather, it is that something will occur out of the person's free will. In other words, Anselm believes that the necessity entailed from God's knowledge is non-compelling necessity, that is subsequent necessity. It is noteworthy that Anselm's subsequent necessity is different from Boethius' conditional necessity, insofar as Boethius' conditional necessity can be the consequence of both the irrevocability of temporal facts or the infallibility of knowledge. But Anselm's subsequent necessity is only entailed from the irrevocability of facts. And the kernel of the difference between Anselm and Boethius is that Anselm does not challenge the universality of human beings' cognitive mode, by which a belief or knowledge needs definite object as the truth maker in order to be qualified as knowledge. He assumes that God also follows this cognitive mode. In order to reply to the problem of how God could get access to the knowledge about future contingents, Anselm still appeals to the metaphysical nature of God's eternity. So now let's have a closer look at Anselm's account of God's eternity. Anselm says that, now, although in eternity there is only a present, it is not a temporal present like ours, but an eternity present that encompasses all times, just as every place and those things that are in any place are contained in the present time, so too every time and those things that are at any time are enclosed all at once in the eternal present. At first sight, Anselm's accounts of eternity shows lots of similarities to Boethius, especially the part about God's own life status. However, they go to different directions. Unlike Boethius, who ends up emphasizing the transcendental future of divine knowledge, Anselm thinks of God's eternity not only as God's own unique existing status, but also in itself as a superior tenseless dimension in which all temporal things' temporality holds a distinctive manner. The eternal dimension is an inclusive dimension in which every temporal fact equally exists. That is to say, in this dimension, there is no passage of time. So things in our past do not elapse, and things in our future are not awaiting to come, but have existed. And moreover, Anselm insists that there is no contradiction between something's non-existence in the temporal future and its existence in the internal dimension. So I cited the second paragraph here. Now, since we have discerned that a thing exists differently in time from how it exists in eternity, so that it is sometimes true that something does not exist in time that does exist in eternity, and that its existence is past in time, but not past in eternity, or future in time, but not future in eternity. There does not seem to be any reason to deny that in the same way, something can be mutable in time that is immutable in eternity. Indeed, there is no more opposition between being mutable in time and being immutable in eternity than there is between not existing at a given time and always existing in eternity, or between having existed or being yet to exist in time and not having existed or not being yet to exist in eternity. So in this passage, Anselm's position appears to be that temporal entities exist in two distinctive dimensions, the successive temporal dimension and the tenseless dimension, i.e. eternity. And I think it is plausible to apply the contemporary A-B series distinction to describe the feature of the temporality existing in these two different dimensions. So A series means that each position in time is either past, present, or future. And the B series of time means that each position is earlier than some and later than some of the other positions. And so the distinctions of the A series are not fixed, but the series B are fixed and permanent because it refers to a fixed relation between different moments. And the A series reflects the way in which we perceive temporal events in daily life, and the B series suggests that the past, the present, and the future equally exist as a fixed sequence. So, but Anselm confidently indicates that the very same thing can have two existing status in these two dimensions without any contradiction. He does not explain why. But for us, the gap between the A-B series or the temporal and tenseless dimension is very hard to be filled, especially with regard to human free will choices and future contingents. There is I also want to mention an alternative interpretation of this text. So it suggests that we do not need to commit that the temporal entities have two distinctive existence in two temporal dimensions, but just that both God and temporal entities exist at once in the tenseless dimension. So in other words, only B series is real. In this sense, God is present to every discrete temporal moment. I will not judge at which interpretation is much better, because I think both of these interpretations face a similar problem about the identity of an agent's consciousness, or say the contrast between what an agent experiences and the metaphysical status of B series or the tenseless dimension. So in what sense can an agent make a future free choice of will existing in the internal dimension? For example, given the fact that I clearly know that I have not yet chosen to drink a cup of tea tomorrow morning. How could it be the case that I have done that anyway? Does this imply that there is a higher self of myself, as perhaps some earlier medieval thinkers would suggest? Anselm is not aware of this problem, and he does not explain further. So, although Anselm's solution remains incomplete and unsatisfactory at this point, his intention of providing a free will defense is demonstrated. So in his view, God's foreknowledge strictly only entails subsequent necessity, which is grounded on the irrevocability of temporal facts. There are future facts for God, not only because God's own existence is of eternity, but also that God's eternity marks a superior temporal spatial dimension in which all temporal facts are contained. In this framework, God has knowledge about future contingents because God is prerogative to get access to the superior dimension of the eternity. So now let me wrap up a bit. According to Boethius, the principle of modes of cognition guarantees that there is no need for God to ground the truth value of his beliefs about future contingents on any actualized status. Even though future contingents have not yet been actualized, God still has a way to gain infallible belief about them. The description of God's unfailing present knowledge helps us to understand how God achieved this. Metaphorically, in God's view, everything is as if it is present to him. And the distinction between simple and conditional necessity partly clears away the contradiction between the nature of knowledge and contingents. So even though the definite outcome of a future contingent is known by God, its necessity is originated from the external condition. However, Boethius' texts seem to be inconsistent, for he seems to overthrow his free will defense at the end of his work, and he contends that God's knowledge is causative. Compared with Boethius, Anselm's project faces trickier metaphysical problem. Anselm consistently demonstrates his libertarian position. For Anselm, every rational being's knowledge, including God's foreknowledge, is on the basis of temporal facts. God has foreknowledge in that he is exclusively accessible to the tenseless dimension of eternity. Anselm does not explain in what sense temporal entities could have different status of existence in different temporal dimensions, nor is he aware of the problem about the identity of an agent's consciousness. That's all. Thank you.